Good morning, friends. Welcome to Sutta Study with Bhante Suddhaso. Hello to Gita, Ela from Poland, Reed, Jens, Bradley from next door, Elaine, Sarah, who says, Bhante, the Piyajatika Sutta you read through last week gave me much food for thought in the last few days about how I consider and practice metta. A breakthrough for me. Thank you. Oh,
Great.
wonderful. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. All right. And also hello to who's watching. Oh, hello, Leonardo from New York City. Oh, you're close. So I should come and say hello soon with masks. Oh, you're originally from Buenos Aires. Cool. Great. All right. And of course, good morning to Bhante Suddhaso. So this morning, we will be studying the Tikaṇḍakī Sutta, Utara Nikaya 5.144. And you can find the link in the live chat. And welcome also to Galaxy from Malaysia and Michael also from New York City, representing far away and so close. And welcome to Blair, who is here physically present. And hello, Ishan. Oh, Ishan is watching from Kansas. Good to know. Great. All right. So I'll pass it on to Bhante so we can start.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Good morning, friends. So as mentioned, today we'll go through the Tikaṇḍakī Sutta. So this is a short discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya, Book of the Fives, Sutta number 144. As usual, I'll read through the sutta and give some explanations, and then at the end we can have some discussion. So the sutta begins. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Saketa in Tikaṇḍakī Grove. There the Blessed One addressed the monks. Monks, auspicious sir, those monks replied to the Blessed One. The Blessed One said this. Monks, from time to time it is good for a monk to dwell perceiving the non-repulsive as repulsive. Monks, from time to time it is good for a monk to dwell perceiving the repulsive as non-repulsive. Monks, from time to time it is good for a monk to dwell perceiving both non-repulsive and repulsive as repulsive. Monks, from time to time, it is good for a monk to dwell perceiving both repulsive and non-repulsive as non-repulsive. Monks, from time to time, it is good for a monk to circumvent both repulsive and non-repulsive and dwell equanimous, mindful, and clearly aware. So these are the 5 modes of perception that the Buddha is recommending that we train ourselves in. So first off, something that we normally consider as not repulsive, we should train ourselves to be able to regard it as repulsive, as undesirable. Second, something which we normally consider repulsive, we should train ourselves to see as non-repulsive, as something which is perfectly acceptable. From time to time, we should train ourselves to see everything, both non-repulsive and repulsive, everything as repulsive. So everything as undesirable, everything is not worth getting involved in or caught up in. And the fourth one, so regarding both repulsive and non-repulsive as non-repulsive. So this is being accepting and tolerant of everything. So training ourselves to be perfectly okay and acceptant of absolutely everything. And the fifth mode of training is to circumvent both repulsive and non-repulsive and dwell equanimous, mindful, and clearly aware. So this is the practice then of completely dropping the judgment mind, completely dropping the preference mind, completely dropping this whole idea of liking and disliking, of approving and disapproving. And being completely okay with reality as it is. So not either leaning into or leaning away from anything. And then the Buddha says, monks, for what benefit would a monk dwell perceiving the non-repulsive as repulsive? An excellent question, especially if you're a hedonist, a greed type. You're probably thinking, why on earth would I want to regard these delicious chocolate cookies as repulsive? That would just be weird. They're not repulsive. They're delicious. They're magnificent. And by regarding them as delicious and magnificent, I experience pleasure and happiness. So this is the thinking of the hedonist. So you might be thinking, well, why on earth would I want to perceive the non-repulsive as repulsive? That seems like I'm undercutting my own happiness. So I recall a few years ago, I've mentioned this story once or twice before. A few years ago, we were having a retreat at our previous monastery. It was a 10-day retreat, and about halfway through it, one of the participants came to meet with me and said, I'm worried that the more I understand Buddhism, the more it's undercutting all of the happiness in my life. And I was like, well, what are you talking about? And she's like, well, because Buddhism is teaching about disenchantment, but I don't want to be disenchanted. She said, I actually quite like all of the pleasant things in my life. I don't want to lose all of those things. So this indicates this kind of short-sighted mentality of being caught up in the appeal of limited, unreliable, short-term, low-quality forms of pleasure and happiness, and missing out on the sublime bliss that comes through the higher development of the mind. So there's a sutta where the Buddha says, if one saw that by letting go of a small pleasure, one could attain a greater pleasure, then a wise person would let go of that small pleasure so that they could attain the greater pleasure. So what the Buddha is pointing to with that statement is that the ordinary pleasant things of the world, so the pleasure of nice cookies and surfing and music and romantic relationships and so on, that's all the low pleasure, the inferior kind of pleasure, the kind of pleasure which is unreliable, that brings limited satisfaction, that brings with it disappointment and grief and loss and pain and disturbance and agitation and restlessness and despair. Whereas the higher happiness is the happiness of equanimity, the happiness of wisdom, the happiness of tranquility, the happiness of non-attachment. Because that's a happiness which is reliable, dependable. It's a happiness which is peaceful, serene, sublime. But in order to be able to get in touch with that higher happiness, we first need to deal with our attachment to the lower happiness, our attachment to the ordinary kinds of worldly pleasure that we tend to get wrapped up in. So it says here, for what benefit would a monk dwell perceiving the non-repulsive as repulsive? Thinking, may lust not arise in me about lust-inducing things. Monks, this is the benefit for which a monk would dwell perceiving the non-repulsive as repulsive. So very simple, so that we don't get enamored with the pleasant things of the world. So we don't fall into lust and craving and passion about the pleasant things of the world. Again, looking at the state of mind when we're caught up in lust and passion and obsession for things, what does that state of mind feel like? It feels really uncomfortable. For me, it feels kind of like my head has been stuffed full of burning straw. It's not pleasant. It's this feeling of claustrophobia, of agitation, of pressure, of constriction. It's not an enjoyable state of mind. So we don't want the mind to be overcome with lust and passion and obsession attachment, and that's not the kind of mind that we want. It's quite uncomfortable. But we also recognize that the world is full of things, full of objects and experiences, which, if we're not careful, we tend to fall into obsession about. We tend to get enamored with and lost in passion for. So we need to train ourselves to see the danger in obsession, the danger in passion, the danger in attachment, the danger in craving, to see the disadvantages, the drawbacks in getting obsessed with unreliable, limited forms of happiness. So this is why we practice perceiving the non-repulsive as repulsive. So for example, you go in for breakfast and there's this nice bag of delicious chocolate cookies from Italy. And of course, the mind immediately goes into thinking, those are fabulous. I really want to take a big handful of those. In fact, forget everything else. I'm just going to take a giant bowl of cookies and milk, and that's it. Nobody can blame me for this. But then you remind yourself, it's like, well, what am I doing? I'm just building up the basis of my own unhappiness. I'm just building up the basis of my own agitation and restlessness and discontent. Why would I hurt myself in that way? That's silly. So then looking at the cookies, not as a source of happiness, but as a source of pain, as a source of disappointment, as a source of grief, as a source of misery. And you notice then the mind starts to lose its enchantment with the cookies. You might still wind up eating them just because, you have to eat something for breakfast. But first, purifying the mind of that obsessive state, purifying the mind of that uncomfortable state of attachment and craving and clinging. Then next, the Buddha says, monks, for what benefit would a monk dwell perceiving the repulsive as non-repulsive? Thinking, may hate not arise in me about hate-inducing things. Monks, this is the benefit for which a monk would dwell perceiving the repulsive as non-repulsive. So this is the flip side. It's also recognizing the other side of greed is aversion. It's wanting to avoid certain things, wanting to reject certain things. So our tendency to fixate on the unpleasant or undesirable aspects of things, to get caught up in hating certain objects or experiences or people or ideas. And recognizing how that tendency towards hating things also generates a great deal of discomfort in the mind. It also causes a lot of mental and emotional anguish and disturbance for us. And also leads to us making really bad choices. So just as with greed, when the mind is overcome with greed, then we tend to make really bad choices. We get with people who aren't good for us, or we're not good for them, or it's just not a good idea. We eat things that are bad for our health. We eat too much. We pursue experiences which are ultimately counterproductive or a waste of time. And then also with things which are prone to generating aversion in us. Then it leads to us doing things based on hate, based on anger, based on dislike, based on prejudice. Again, you don't need to look much farther than the news over the past few months to find countless examples of this. News since the beginning of human history, to be realistic. The oldest story in the book, it's greed, hatred, and delusion. It's what we see going on for as long as there's been conscious beings. So we need to make an effort to inoculate the mind against the arising of hate, the arising of aversion. So when we notice that we have a tendency to regard something as repulsive, then we need to make an effort to counteract that, to look at the benefits or the good qualities of something, especially if it's another person, looking at their good qualities, looking at, if nothing else, look at their capacity to develop good qualities, because everybody has that. even the most unbelievably despicable person in the world, and you probably have an idea right now who the most despicable person in the world is, even the most unbelievably despicable person in the world has the capacity to develop good qualities. Whether he does or not is another subject, but he has the capacity to develop good qualities. So we can at least respect that and appreciate that. Even if the person is not actually developing any good qualities, we can respect the fact that they have the ability to. So in the Mahayana tradition, there's a lot of talk about Buddha nature, which in its simplest terms is the capacity that every sentient being has to become fully enlightened. So when you look at another person, instead of fixating on their faults and flaws and limitations and defilements, instead we recognize that there is the seed of a Buddha in that person. That person has the capacity to become a Buddha. That person has the capacity to become an Arhat. That person has the ability to completely purify their own mind. Maybe they're not doing such a great job of it right now, but they have the ability. And that is something praiseworthy. There's a bodhisattva mentioned in the Avatamsaka Sutra, a bodhisattva called Siddhapaributta, which it has two meanings. This name has two meanings, which is a really cute double meaning. So one meaning is never despising. So he's the bodhisattva who never despises any other being. And the other meaning of his name is always despised, because other people would always make fun of him. So the bodhisattva never despised would go around saying to people, like whenever people would do annoying or upsetting things, he would say, well, there's no way I could possibly despise you because you're going to be a Buddha someday. How could I hate a future Buddha? That would be really inappropriate. So that's why he was called Bodhisattva Never Despised. But then other people would mock him and make fun of him, like, oh, how can you say that that person's going to be a Buddha? Look how bad they are. Look how immoral they are. Look how unwise they are. How can you say that person's going to be a Buddha? So other people were always criticizing him and making fun of him. This is why his name has these two meanings. So never despises, but always despised. Siddhapaributta. So recognizing that, when you hate another person, you're hating a future Buddha. Isn't that completely inappropriate? So you can recognize that they currently have some unwholesome qualities, and you can wish for them to be free of those unwholesome qualities, but you don't hate them. That would be completely inappropriate. And then regarding ordinary things, again, maybe you go in for lunch and there's mangoes on the table and you happen to be someone who hates mangoes. And you're like, oh, disgusting, they're serving mangoes again, vile, hideous. Well, what are we doing to ourselves? We're fueling our tendency towards aversion. We're fueling our tendency towards disliking. We're fueling our tendency towards aversion. That's not doing us any good. So instead we can think, oh, how lovely, somebody donated mangoes to the monastery. Isn't that really sweet? How wonderful, there's food to eat. How wonderful, somebody cares about me. And recognizing that the mango in and of itself is not repulsive. It's our ideas and attitudes that make it seem repulsive. So if we switch our ideas and attitudes, then it becomes non-repulsive. It becomes appealing even. So training the mind in this way helps to break our habits of desire and aversion, which is critical because breaking our habits of desire and aversion are right at the heart of Buddhist practice. Because desire and aversion is the source of all dukkha. It's also a great part of what we identify as me. I am the person who likes surfing. I'm not, by the way, but I'm just using an example. I am the person who likes surfing. I am the person who hates cilantro. That one's actually true. I am the person who likes going to the beach. That one's not particularly true. I am the person who hates haircuts. Also not true, as you can see. I like haircuts. The more frequent, the better. So recognizing that a great deal of our sense of self-identity is built up in our preferences. I am the person who likes these things and dislikes those things. In fact, I remember when I was a teenager, before Facebook, there was a very popular social networking website called MySpace. Anybody remember MySpace? Yeah. And so you'd have like your likes and your dislikes, the things that you approved of and the things you didn't approve of. So you look at somebody's profile and you'd immediately get a sense of their personality based upon their likes and their dislikes. And it's like, oh, okay. So this is how we define ourselves very often, is in terms of what we like and what we dislike. So that's also another element of wearing down our desire and aversion, is that it starts to wear down our self-centeredness, our self-identity, our self-obsession. It starts to wear down our obsession with me and mine, who I am, what I am, which then contributes towards the goal of enlightenment, the goal of full awakening. And then the next two categories are similar. So the Buddha says, monks, for what benefit would a monk dwell perceiving both non-repulsive and repulsive as repulsive? Thinking, may lust not arise in me about lust-inducing things. Monks, this is the benefit for which a monk would dwell perceiving the non-repulsive and repulsive as repulsive. So this is the case of regarding everything. So whether we normally dislike it or like it, whether we like it or dislike it, we just regard everything as unappealing. So the Buddha actually mentions this elsewhere as a practice in a number of places, most notably the Girimananda Sutta, where the Buddha says one should cultivate sabba loka anabhirata sanya. So the perception of not liking anything in the world, not seeking pleasure or satisfaction in anything in the world, which I just find delicious. But that's because I'm a hate type, so I like hating things. And so the discovery that you can actually use your tendency towards aversion as a tool on the path was great news for me. I was like, awesome. So it turns out that hating stuff can actually be used on the path to enlightenment. That's wonderful. Good news. So, by the way, the tendency towards greed can also be used on the path to enlightenment, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So why do we do that? That's because when we see that absolutely nothing in the world is appealing, nothing in the world is desirable, nothing in the world is worth seeking, then what does the mind naturally do? It stops seeking anything in the world, anything of the world, as a basis for happiness, and it starts looking for something else. And there's only one other thing, which is nibbana. There's only one other thing, which is the unconditioned, the unformed, the formless. There's only one other thing, which is the absolute. So then when one perceives absolutely everything in the world as undesirable, then the mind naturally inclines towards the unconditioned. The mind naturally inclines towards the absolute. So when one sees absolutely everything in the world as unappealing, undesirable, then one tends to become very resolute in one's spiritual practice. By the way, this perception needs to be accompanied by a reflection on karma and rebirth, because otherwise it can just lead to suicidal depression. So one also needs to recognize that until we attain full enlightenment, we will just keep cycling around within samsara. We'll just keep spinning around between different states of existence. all of which are unappealing, all of which are unsatisfying, all of which are undesirable. So then this reflection, sabaloke anabirata sanya, so the perception of the undesirability of the entire growth, must be accompanied by the reflection on karma and rebirth, because then our mind naturally inclines towards enlightenment, naturally inclines towards resolution and dedication in one's spiritual practice. And the next category, it says, monks, for what benefit would a monk dwell perceiving both repulsive and non-repulsive as non-repulsive? Thinking, may hate not arise in me about hate-inducing things. Monks, this is the benefit for which a monk would dwell perceiving both repulsive and non-repulsive as non-repulsive. So this is regarding everything in the world as being appealing, regarding everything in the world as being tolerable, everything in the world as worth accepting and approving of. And that's this is meant to counter hatred of samsara. So hatred of samsara is another trap which we can easily fall into in our practice. As we cultivate dispassion and disenchantment, then we can easily wind up hating reality. And what is this disgusting mess that I find myself caught in life after life after life? I hate this crap. I wish it would all just come to an end. So we can find ourselves getting in that kind of mind. But that kind of mind state is also counterproductive to enlightenment. So enlightenment is not the rejection of samsara. Enlightenment is the understanding of both samsara and nibbana. Enlightenment is the full understanding of every aspect of reality, and also the full acceptance that reality is exactly what it is, and it's perfectly okay, just like that. So it's recognizing that absolutely everything in samsara is perfectly okay, no problem at all. It all has a place. It's all part of one seamlessly interlocking whole. Everything, life and death, sickness and health, food and feces, absolutely everything fits perfectly into the interlocking puzzle of samsara. And if any one piece was missing, then the puzzle is broken. If any one piece was missing, then samsara would be completely non-functional. In fact, if any one piece was missing, then the entire thing would wink out of existence. It couldn't possibly exist if any piece was missing. So we can't hate anything in samsara because absolutely everything fits in perfectly. Everything has its place. We still recognize that there are wholesome things and unwholesome things, moral choices and immoral choices, but that's also part of samsara. Samsara has both the good and the evil. It has both the moral and the immoral. That's one part of it. So we accept that everything is here. Good politicians, bad politicians, they're all here. Of course, we mostly see the bad ones, but that's the result of our own karma. Again, this is meant to counter the tendency to fall into the hatred of reality, hatred of samsara. And instead recognizing that absolutely everything in samsara has its place. So we can approve of every cog in the machine because we see that every cog in the machine is necessary. It's a necessary part. And then finally, the fifth one, he says, monks, for what benefit would a monk circumvent both repulsive and non-repulsive, and dwell equanimous, mindful, and clearly aware? It says, thinking, being mindful and clearly aware, may no lust at all ever arise in me about lust-inducing things. May no hate at all ever arise in me about hate-inducing things. May no delusion at all ever arise in me about delusion-inducing things. Monks, this is the benefit for which a monk would circumvent both repulsive and non-repulsive, and dwell equanimous, mindful, and clearly aware. So this is the highest of the five. It's the ideal that we aim for. So the mind which is not relating to the world in terms of repulsive or unrepulsive. It's not relating to the world in terms of desirable or undesirable. It is equanimous, which means the mind is perfectly poised, balanced, neither approving nor rejecting, neither liking nor disliking, but rather accepting that reality is what it is. And it's mindful and clearly aware. So this is not the equanimity of sleep, nor is it apathy, nor is it indifference. So it's not this uncaring blankness, but rather it is fully, clearly aware of reality as it is, and recognizes that nothing is worth liking and nothing is worth disliking. Nothing is worth hating. Nothing is worth loving. Reality just is what it is. And any reactivity towards any part of reality simply generates further defilements in the mind. This gets us caught deeper and deeper in the mud. So the first 4 steps are ways of training the mind. So when you're leaning too far to the left, then you start going towards the right. When you're going too much to the right, then you turn towards the left. Those are the first few steps. But this final step is when you just walk straight on the path, not veering towards either the left or the right. Therefore, there's no need for course corrections. So the course corrections are a very unsubtle, unrefined way of practicing. But in the beginning, that's actually what's most necessary. We need to use the stronger methods in order to bring the mind closer to the center. But then when the coarser defilements have been ironed out, then we can use this more subtle, refined, and precise form of practice, which is mindfulness and equanimity. So this clear, mindful equanimity, which leads unerringly towards enlightenment. So that's the end of the sutta. So again, a relatively short and straightforward discourse. This time, if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and type them in the live chat and we can have some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And welcome to Melinda. Good to see you. And Yanni. And Elaine was asking, every time you say delicious, I have a visceral reaction. What is that all about? Greed to fuel a sugar addiction?
Yeah, I think you need to look at that. Sounds like you might have some attachment to food issues going on.
All right. And Geeta is asking, Bhante, is nibbida or not attaching to any state of mind what this sutra is showing us?
Nibbida, usually translated as disenchantment, which I quite like that translation. Literally, nibbida means not seeking, what it really means. But yeah, this whole discourse is pointing at ways of training the mind for nibbida, training the mind for disenchantment. Yeah, that's correct.
And Breed is asking, Bhante, excuse my frankness here. As a married man who has a physical relationship with his wife, I find this difficult and worry about how it could impact the part of my life that involves sex.
Yeah.
Is there a balance here? Can one reasonably practice perceiving the repulsive with regard to their spouse, or will it inevitably hurt a physical relationship? Am I being clear here?
You are, in fact, being clear. So this is why, historically, the vast majority of enlightened beings have been monastics. Is because it is, in fact, quite difficult to practice the complete Buddhist path while maintaining a sexual relationship. Because sexual relationships, while they can be a training ground for developing a lot of wholesome qualities, kindness, consideration, compassion, generosity, these are all very good qualities that you can develop in a sexual relationship. However, sexual relationships also tend to fuel desire, attachment, and delusion. That's not so good. So this is challenging. So if you're maintaining a sexual relationship, then you'll notice that some parts of your practice will improve and other parts will stagnate or possibly even backslide. But that's basically the trade-off that you're making. You're making that kind of trade-off, hopefully with full awareness that that's what you're doing. And maybe with the intention that later in this life or maybe in a future life that you'll take on a celibate spiritual practice. But if that's not in the cards for you right now, well, just do the best you can. Develop everything else in the path. So the Noble Eightfold Path is quite comprehensive. You can practice almost all of it without being celibate. So practice everything else until eventually you'll get to a point where you realize that in order to make progress, it's time to be celibate. But that might not happen to you for years, decades, or lifetimes. So keep working on every other aspect of the path. But do be aware that if you want to attain awakening, then at some point you have to let go of sexuality. At some point you need to go beyond it, but maybe not in this life. That said, if you're really strongly feeling that celibacy is right for you, have a conversation with your wife first. So don't just one day, just out of the blue, you're like, guess what, honey, I'm celibate. She'll be like, lawyer. Yeah, that's not going to go terribly well. Yeah, it needs to be done carefully. There are cases of people who are in relationships, sexual relationships, and eventually decide that they need to start moving away from sexual activity for the sake of their own practice. And that's it can be a difficult and painful process, especially if your partner is not Buddhist. If your partner is not Buddhist, it's going to be really difficult. If they are, then sometimes things work out okay. So one example I'm thinking of, there's a couple I know of who they're both very sincere Buddhist practitioners and have been for 20 or 30 years now. And at some point, they just decided that they were going to be celibate together. So they spend a great deal of their time visiting monasteries and going on retreats together. But even when they're not at the monasteries, they live a celibate life as co-practitioners, as people who encourage each other to stay on the path of practice. So there are examples of this. But yeah, if your partner is not interested, then that's going to complicate things quite a bit. And if you are not interested, well, then next life maybe, or maybe in a few years, we'll see. Okay.
All right. And Nikita's asking, is this to maintain a state of equanimity? Also connecting back to the Four Noble Truths. I think that still Nibbida.
It's more about cultivating equanimity, getting closer to equanimity. So again, if one has a strong tendency towards desire and greed, then you cultivate the perception of the disadvantages, of the drawbacks in whatever you're greedy about. And the disadvantages and drawbacks of greed itself. If your tendency is aversion, then you cultivate the perception of positivity towards whatever you hate, whatever you're aversive towards. And also, once again, recognizing the harmful nature of aversion and cultivating instead a positive attitude towards contentment, a positive attitude towards mental serenity. And this is helping to, again, correct one's mind so that it's not veering so heavily in one direction or the other. So equanimity itself is actually a relatively subtle practice, because if the mind still has strong tendencies, then when we think we're practicing equanimity, we'll still be leaning to one side or another. So you first need to get the strong leanings ironed out so that you're relatively upright. Then you can practice equanimity without straying. Okay?
Right. And Michael is asking, can we say that samsara for the purpose of our discussion is dualistic, good, bad, happy, sad, high, low? Well, a higher truth might lie in non-duality.
You can say that to a point. Yeah.
Okay. And hello to Marielle Ramon. Good to see you. And Leonardo says, would you please consider to mention the relationship with today's teaching in developing a bodhicitta mind and emptiness sunyata?
Yeah, so bodhicitta is defined as the aspiration for awakening, the mind which seeks enlightenment, which seeks awakening. And what was the other?
Sunyata.
Sunyata. And sunyata in this case is recognizing that, first off, nothing exists from its own side. Nothing exists in and of itself, but rather things exist in terms of their relationship to other things. And that particularly applies in terms of things that are repulsive or non-repulsive. So Ayasoma walks in and she sees mangoes on the table and she's like, hallelujah, yes, at last, fresh mango. And I walk in and I'm like, oh, well, at least there's other things to eat. So is a mango repulsive? Well, I would say yes. I would say no. Is a mango desirable? Well, I would say no, and she would say yes. So is a mango inherently either repulsive or desirable? No. Ayasoma is nodding, but that's because she's being deliberately obtuse. So the mango in and of itself is neither good nor bad, delicious nor disgusting. A mango is just a mango. Technically, it's not even that. But for the moment, we can say a mango is just a mango. So then, in this case, sunyata is also recognizing that the value judgments that we place on things has absolutely nothing to do with the thing itself. It's just something that we project. And it's recognizing also that our desire and aversion, our projected value judgments onto things, is preventing us from attaining awakening. So as our aspiration for awakening becomes stronger, then it becomes increasingly clear that we need to work on overcoming our desire and aversion, which is what this discourse is talking about. Okay.
Great. Thank you. And hello also to Jean, who says good evening. So I assume you're on the other side of the world, Jean. And there, Michael is saying, like, don't like, delicious, disgusting. I've often observed life that way. That is, where there is a wish that things were different, opposite to what they are, then I'm on thin ice. You can do without sex, but you can't do without food and continue in this body. Eating food, my likes and dislikes are hard to avoid. I try to stop and observe pleasant feelings. Chocolate cookie are arising in me.
Yeah, that's true. You have to eat to survive. So then we need to change our relationship to food. So viewing food as nourishment for the body rather than as a source of entertainment. Yeah.
All right. And Pawan is saying, hello, Bhante, thank you for the talk. Can you highlight the drawbacks of physical relationships? Celibacy has doing me real good in the practice. Want to strengthen my volition.
Yeah, well, one thing, again, is just recognizing that the state of mind of desire is very uncomfortable. So when we're caught up in lust, then the mind is really unhappy. It's really disturbed. It's not pleasant. And by contrast, when the mind is very serene and peaceful, it's like this morning we were doing meditation in the cool, misty air on the back porch, and it was really delightful. Just to sit peacefully and practice samadhi in the cool morning mist for an hour. It was just lovely. So you contrast these two states of mind, and you're like, okay, the burning agitation of unsatisfied lust versus the cool, peaceful serenity of samadhi. It's really no contest. When you line these things up next to each other, there's really no comparison. But with the lusting mind, we're so fixated on the presumed pleasantness of something which might happen in the future that we completely ignore how much agony we're causing ourselves right here in the present moment. So we need to pay attention to the agony that we're causing in the present moment. And then we'll start to realize that we're just hurting ourselves. We're just hurting ourselves out of some fantasy of something pleasant that might happen. So there's no denying that sexual activity is pleasant. It's quite nice, in fact. There's a reason why people get so obsessed with it. In fact, quite a nice, pleasant thing. However, it's very harmful to one's peace of mind. It's very harmful to one's equanimity. And that harm is quite long-lasting. So we need to be careful about this. And then also recognizing that sexual activity itself represents only a tiny fraction of our life. The vast majority of our life is spent not having sex. Even if you're an extremely promiscuous person, still the vast majority of your time is spent not having sex. And then you'll notice that then a lot of that time then is this disturbed, agitated, uncomfortable, dissatisfied, discontent longing, punctuated by these occasional brief periods of pleasure. Doesn't sound so great anymore, does it? And this is even assuming that the times when you're having sex are exclusively amazing, which in actuality, if you look at your actual experience, you'll notice that it's often not so amazing. It's a mixture of pleasant and not so pleasant. It's a mixture of enjoyment and agitation. There's a whole, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I assume that most of us are adults, so we can reflect on our own experiences. And if we reflect honestly on our own experiences, we'll be like, oh yeah, not 100% pleasant. No. So when we're really honest with ourselves, then we see that the whole sexuality thing is just, it's a losing game from start to finish. Not so good. Okay?
Oh my God, I'm dying here with the comment section. Geeta says, sorry about the sexual activity. It's absolutely disgusting. So sorry. It's just a delusion. It's so sad. And Bradley says, Geeta's clearly not a Greek type.
Yeah.
I'm dying. And Bradley also says, your comment about agony is spot on. I stayed up late watching Netflix and now I'm exhausted. Yep, the drawbacks of greed. And Bhante, Michael is saying, thank you, Bhante. A wonderful, direct, easily absorbed sutta, at least superficially. That is, living it is another thing, a volition, a goal. And Juan says, great explanation. Thank you, Bhante. All right, so I think that's all for this morning. Thank you so much for joining us to study the Dhammam. And we will be meeting again this evening for a talk on overcoming fear and doubt.
Great, by Ayasoma.
Or Bhante Suddhaso. Who will it be? You will only find out at 7:30 p.m. on BNN. And then tomorrow morning, we will be meeting again with Bhante Suddhaso for another sutta study. And tomorrow evening again, and Friday again. Friday evening, there will be monk chats. So any questions you have that are Dharma related or close to being Dharma related, feel free to bring them on Friday evening, and we will do our best, try our best to answer them. All right, so look forward to seeing you soon, and have a great, and we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.